Right, so next we have to do 5.2.2, which is Dividend Spate. We don't really have to go through the whole process I'm going to show, but just as some revision as to how dividends work, we're going to just look at the actual accounts for dividends. Now, dividends, let me just take those out. Good, so dividends basically, there's a dividends for shareholders or shareholders for dividends account, which is a liability, and then your expense account called dividends on ordinary shares. On your shareholders for dividends, it will always start with last year's balance on the credit side. It is a liability. We still owe the people dividends. And still on the credit side will be this year's final dividend, which hasn't been paid yet. It will only be paid in the new year. And that would be a credit to dividends, shareholders for dividends, and a debit to the expense called dividends on ordinary shares. Further, in the shareholders for dividends, whatever we started the year off, what we owed the shareholders from last year, we will pay this year. So we're going to have a payment which will equal our opening balance, and that will leave us with a closing balance, which will equal this year's final, because we paid whatever was outstanding, and the only new entry is the dividends on ordinary shares. And that balance would then equal whatever we had left for the final of this year. In the dividends for ordinary shares, we'll have the figure for the final, which we put through to the shareholders for dividends, and then whatever we paid as an interim dividend for this year. Those two together is then my total expense for the year, which goes to appropriation. So let's do it with the information we've got now here. We will, at the end, just look at to do it in a shorter version when we actually get this question in the paper. So firstly, look for the balances of shareholders. Last year, in other words, this year's opening, 50,000. So my opening balance, 50,000. Closing balance, 98,000. 98,000 credit, which means above the line it would be on the debit side and below the line on the credit side. Whatever I started the year off with, I have to pay now, and that was last year's final. So that 50,000 would immediately be paid. So what is my final dividend, or my balance? My final dividend for this year? It would be the 98,000. I can also work it out. Add that side, it's 148,000, which means this side must also be 148, which means that difference is 98,000, which must go to dividends on ordinary shares. So what did I pay so far? That 50,000. Remember, I'm just interested in what I paid. The other amount that I paid would be the interim for this year, which goes to dividends on ordinary shares. So it won't be in the information up there, so I must go down and see if they don't give me any additional. And here's the information about dividends and capital. The third one, interim dividend of 70,000 was paid. So my interim dividend of 70,000 was paid. So just to close off this account, it's 168,000, which means that side must also be 168,000. So the amount going to appropriation is 168,000. So for cash flow, what did I pay? 50,000, 70,000. So the 50,000 last year's final, or the opening balance of the shareholders for dividends, the 70, the interim. So I must just look for last year's final and this year's interim. And that is my payment for dividends on the cash flow statement. So it's simply 50 plus 70. So you don't have to go through the whole redoing the general ledger. It will take too long. But this is just some revision on the actual workings of the account. So I'm simply going to, on my answer sheet, say it was last year's 50,000, which was the balance of the shareholders for dividends, plus the interim, which they told me under the information of 70,000, which gave me 120,000 in total. Good. So the next thing I have to do is calculate the net change in cash and cash equivalents. So let's look at how we're going to do that. Remember, when we do cash and cash equivalents, you must know the layout of the note for cash and cash equivalents, the actual note on the cash flow statement. And that note basically have the figures for last year and this year. Let's put it in. It's got the net change. Then it will have this year's figures in, this year, and it will have last year's figures in. Good, so if I know that layout, I can go and look for the figures. It would normally have bank and cash, petty cash, cash float, whatever, but in some cases it will have the two. It will just have the total cash and cash equivalent. So we must look at the information that they provide us with. So let's just go and see. Now if I look there, they give me cash and cash equivalents for this year, 2,500, last year 245,000, but also always look for a bank overdraft, because the last year we didn't have one, but this year it ended on an overdraft of 27,500. So my total cash and cash equivalents for last year was 245, but this year I've got a negative figure of 27,500 and a positive figure of 2,500, which means my total cash and cash equivalent is a negative figure of 25,000. So if I look at this year, it is the minus. Let's just put it in there. It was the minus 27,500. So there it would just be cash and equivalents. Okay, and this year it is the 27,500 overdraft, which is minus 27,000, and the normal 2,500, whatever that was, most probably a float or whatever, which means in total it was a minus 25,000. Last year was a positive figure of, let's just get back there, cash and cash, 245,000. So last year was 245,000. Now my net change would then be, let's get that back. Sorry. The net change for the year, take last year minus this year, or so it's 245 minus this year, but be careful because it's a minus. It means it's 245 minus minus, and a minus gives me a plus. If you think of math, so it's 245,000 plus 25,000. So if this is a negative, I add the 2. So it's 245 plus 250, and that gave me a balance of 270,000. And it would mean that to get from a positive to a negative, I had to actually spend the whole 245 plus a further 25. So I spent 270,000. So my cash and cash equivalents change is minus. Important with cash flow statement, you must put it in as a minus if it's an outflow, and that is minus 270,000.